welcome to my first official podcast for Felony Spectator. I wanted to start these podcasts off with a crime that happened very close to home for me, and it shook up my town, which was right beside Abbotsford, BC, where this took place. And I lived a short 20-minute drive from where this all happened. It's about Terry Driver, also known as the Abbotsford Killer. And I will tell you from experience that everyone in my high school was terrified. It was the topic of conversation in everyone's circle. All the moms gossip about it, and everyone was scared to let their teenagers out at night. Terry Driver is a convicted murderer from Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, who attacked 2 teenage girls, killing 1. And then he went on to tormenting the small town before he got sloppy and arrested for his crimes in 1995. Abbotsford, British Columbia is about a 30-minute drive from Vancouver, BC. It's a pretty small town and definitely has a small town feel. It's mainly a farming community and was considered the Bible Belt of British Columbia and still is today. Meaning there are lots of churches and the majority of people living there are either very, very religious or spiritual in some form. I'm pretty sure there are more churches than there are Starbucks in Abbotsford. Abbotsford was a very wholesome community. Back then, people didn't worry about locking their doors or walking alone at night. People knew their neighbors and they would see their community at church on Sundays. People just trusted each other and they didn't really have too much to worry about as far as crime goes. That is until October 13th, 1995. This case was in the news and on TV daily, and it was the first time that people, especially women, were afraid to be alone. And of course, our parents were worried about their teens as well. Nobody could imagine how or why this was happening in Abbotsford, BC. Terry Driver would soon be known as the Abbotsford Killer, the one responsible for shaking up the small town and instilling fear into the community. Terry was born in 1965, and his parents don't really have anything nice to say about him in his early years. His parents just said he generally didn't listen, and they remember him as being a bad kid. He spent most of his time in day programs for troubled kids, and by the age of 6, he was given up to a local foundation for troubled children. Basically, his parents gave up custody. They just couldn't handle him anymore. Allegedly, at the age of 2, he tried to light his parents' house on fire. Sorry, that's not funny, but it's crazy that a 2-year-old would do that. He physically fought with other kids, he threw things, he spat on others, and just was quite defiant. They hoped by putting him in these day programs that he would learn how to be better behaved and respect people. When he turned 11, he finally returned home. Shortly after that, his parents split up and his father would get custody about 2 years later. I understand this is mostly just due to his behavior. His mom had a hard time controlling him, so she sent him to live with his dad in hopes that he would have better success. But between the age of 13 and 14, he would fire a pistol through a neighbor's window. He would also throw rocks at other windows, and he was very well known to police as a juvenile. He was also regularly doing B&Es and shoplifting. The strange thing was, Terry Driver was never convicted of any of his crimes as a juvenile. For some reason, there either wasn't enough evidence or he just wasn't convicted. Terry's dad was also a highly decorated police sergeant on the Vancouver police force, so some would speculate whether there was a connection there. Not saying his dad had a hand in anything, but maybe the justice system just excused Terry's crimes due to who his dad was. All speculation, of course. We don't know for sure. Not saying anything. Terry would later be diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome and OCD. But as he got older, he seemed to calm down, straighten out his life, and on the outside seemed like a relatively normal guy. Driver graduated from a career preparation program in printing at Vancouver Technical Secondary and got a job at Abbotsford Printing. His former employers there would go on to say that he was a really nice guy and he worked hard, and they would have never guessed that he was capable of doing anything even close to murder. Terry would also go on to be a Boy Scout leader and was really great with the kids there and never had any complaints from the parents. Terry married in 1990 to a woman by the name of Val. Val met Terry when she signed up to volunteer at the Boys and Girl Scouts. She was looking to get out of the house and meet other people. At 24 years old, Terry was a supervisor at their local scouting chapter, and Val liked his take charge attitude. He seemed responsible and was very confident, and they would go on to date and realize that they both wanted kids. So to her, he seemed perfect. After only 3 weeks of dating, they were engaged, and then they quickly got married and settled in Abbotsford. They found Abbotsford was a very peaceful community, and Terry would enjoy going fishing at the nearby rivers. Terry and Val would also soon have 2 kids while they were living in Abbotsford. It didn't take long before Terry would show Val his true colors. She would say that he would have a short fuse with her, punch holes in the wall when he was mad, and spend hours at a time out of the home, sometimes fishing and other times going to crime scenes after hearing about them on the police scanner. This was his favorite hobby, and he would call this scanner chasing. He would listen to the scanner nonstop, and it was rarely turned off. Val decided to stick with him though, and she tried her best just to tiptoe around his behavior. She felt she married him for better or for worse, but little did she know what Terry was truly capable of. On October 13th, 1995, Friday the 13th, 2 16-year-old girls, Misty Cockrell and Tanya Smith, were at a party, and they would eventually decide to walk to Misty's boyfriend's house nearby where he too was having a party. Tanya and Misty were best friends. They were like any other typical teenage girls, and they loved going to the mall, they liked to hang out with their friends and boys, and some would say that they were inseparable. They were both 16 at the time, and they went to high school together as well. While on their way to the second party, they actually joked about it being Friday the 13th and said something like, "Just watch, someone is going to jump out of the bushes at us." Coincidentally, not long after they made this joke, a man did jump out from behind a bush holding an aluminum baseball bat, saying, "Hey, you bitches, you want a party?" He must have either overheard them or he was following them. The girls didn't know what to do or how to respond, so they just did whatever the man told them because they were so scared of him. He forced them into the bushes, where he then demanded that they take off their clothes. They were still frozen with fear and really scared for their lives, so they just did whatever the attacker wanted. He asked them to lay on the ground, and Tanya did right away, while Misty tried to beg him to leave them alone, and she promised to keep everything a secret. She even tried to fake an asthma attack to stall him, but he called her out in a lie because she didn't have one of those puffer things. While the girls were on the ground, the attacker would put the bat down briefly while reaching for his zipper to rape Tanya first. This is when Misty grabbed the baseball bat and started to swing at the man, mostly hitting him just in his shoulder. He unfortunately was able to get the bat away from her and threatened that she was going to die. She tried to run, but she tripped over branches, and her attacker would then proceed to beat her until she fell unconscious and leave her there for dead. Sadly, while Misty was passed out from her beating, the attacker would repeatedly rape Tanya, beat her, and then take her lifeless body and toss it into the nearby river. Sadly, coroners said that she probably would not have survived the beating, but it was ultimately the drowning that ended her life. Sometime later, when the attacker had left, Misty woke up. She was face down in the dirt and confused. Tanya wasn't there, and Misty was naked, and she just wanted to go home. When she stood, she could feel a hot rush of liquid streaming from her ear, and would later learn that it was blood and spinal fluid leaking out. The bushes where they were right beside the hospital, and being that she was in a lot of pain, she decided to stumble across the parking lot into the emergency room. A triage nurse would scream at the sight of her. Misty said she didn't really know how bad everything was. She just felt really disoriented and confused. But once she caught sight of her reflection in the glass of the emergency room, she would pass out right there on the floor. Misty had suffered broken fingers, a broken arm, severe skull fractures, and what would later be described as a fist-size hole in her head, presumably from the bat. It was a miracle she was even able to walk to the hospital at all. It is said that some of the hospital workers ran outside to find the attacker, but he was long gone by then. Everything at this point just seems like it's straight out of a horror movie. Tanya, Misty's best friend, was later found floating in the Vedder River. This attack hit the small town hard. There had been bad things before, but nothing like this. Nothing like the brutal beating and murder of an innocent teenage girl. The attention the attacker was getting would also be filling his ego. He would then start tormenting the police with phone calls to continue his need for this attention. In his first phone call to the police, he would say, quote, "I'm the killer. Her right nipple tasted so good," end quote. The public wasn't aware that there were any bite marks found on Tanya, so the police immediately knew that they were dealing with the real killer. He called again right away and said, quote, "You guys did a real thorough job, but do you think I would be stupid enough to leave a fingerprint behind?" End quote. Side note, he was actually stupid enough to leave DNA evidence behind in the form of his semen. 20 minutes later, he called again and taunted the police by saying, quote, "Are you having trouble finding the killer?" End quote. This time, dispatch was able to ask the caller if he had any information to provide, and he goes on to say, quote, "No, I'm the one. I'm giving you a chance to try and find me. I'll be looking around for someone else," end quote.
I'm the one. You're giving you the chance to try and find me. I'll be cruising around looking for someone else.
All of these calls came from payphones, and by the time police were able to find where these payphones were, he was never there. At this point, police don't have much to go on, but they were warning the public not to go out alone, not to go outside at night, and be careful. Lock your doors, especially for the women. About a week after the attack, Misty would still be in the hospital healing from her surgery and her horrible injuries, and Tanya's family would also have her funeral. But little did they know that the attacker was there as well. And I think a lot of the community was there just to pay their respects, and he wouldn't have seemed totally out of place because he brought his preschool-aged children with him. He would have appeared to be a family man just mourning the loss and member of the community. A few weeks later, on Halloween, the police got another phone call from the attacker, describing in detail what he would do to his next victim. This time, Misty would also be awake, and she would be helping the police come up with a composite sketch of her attacker. Unfortunately, her memory of the event still wasn't the best. She was still recovering from her injuries, so the sketch wasn't really that close to what Cherry Driver actually looked like. Unfortunately, this was leading police to a lot of dead ends and false sightings. The community wanted answers. Their sense of safety had been completely stripped, as was surrounding communities, because nobody actually knew where the attacker lived. People were submitting open letters to the newspaper begging for the killer to turn himself in. According to a newspaper report by the province in 1995, Christina Linden, the famous wife of famous NHL hockey star Trevor Linden, also produced a composite sketch of someone who came to her home and harassed her. And he looked closely to the sketch made in Abbotsford, where police were warning women all over to be careful and be on the lookout. Police also really wanted to get this guy, so they finally decided to release some of the audio to the public of one of the phone calls made to police. Misty confirmed that it was indeed his voice, but sadly, nobody came forward. Val Driver, Terry's wife, would later claim in the TV series The Devil You Know, which aired 16 years after the incident, that she did come forward. But she would say that once they spoke with her husband, it was determined that he wasn't a suspect. She would go on to say that she called again, but was dismissed as they already discredited her original claim. 4 months later, in February 1996, Terry Driver would take a crowbar and steal Tanya's gravestone out of the cemetery. He then called a local radio station, Radio Max, and told them to check the cars in the parking lot before hanging up. One of the staff members did and found the headstone on the hood of one of the cars. Written on the stone in marker was, quote, "She was not the first, she won't be the last. I'm still looking, you won't find me," end quote. And "One day, Misty." The headstone had a picture of Tanya taped on it, and the killer circled the picture and wrote, "Yummy tit," with an arrow to her chest. Again, it wasn't public knowledge of the bite mark on Tanya. The attention the attacker was getting was obviously filling his ego still. He obviously loved it and he wanted to keep it going. So 2 days later, he called the police again, asking them if they liked the present that he left. This time, when he called the police from a payphone, they finally got a witness who was able to give them a pretty good description of the man and the vehicle he was driving. A few days after that, a woman called the police frantic because someone had thrown a wrench through her front window and there was an envelope taped to it. On the envelope, it would say, "From the killer, call 911." And on the back, "From the Abbey killer, call 911." Inside the envelope was a newspaper clipping with a picture of Misty and the words, "Lucky to be alive," as well as a long letter confessing to the rape and murder of Tanya and the assault of Misty, as well as 3 other women in Abbotsford. There was also newspaper clippings of unsolved murders, all the victims stabbed to death in 1989. Driver was getting sloppy now and obviously overconfident because he slipped up. The police would find a fingerprint on the clear sticky tape he used to attach the envelope to the wrench. Now, police had voice recordings, handwriting, fingerprints, and a very distinguishable bite mark to use as evidence once they found who was actually responsible. While the police waited to find a match to the fingerprint, they would release more audio of the killer. Donald Driver, Terry's own brother, would call the police and say that it sounded a lot like his brother Terry. Audrey, Terry and Donald's mom, would also call the police and say that everyone in the whole family thought it sounded like Terry. In fact, the family said he was also acting unusually strange for the past little while. He admitted to his sister that he attended Tanya's funeral, even though the family didn't know Tanya. And he had a heated argument with his brother in which Terry would say, "Don't fuck with me, you don't know me anymore, and you don't know what I'm capable of doing anymore," end quote. I would presume that this was out of character of Terry's, and paired with the audio of his voice, his family probably knew they needed to do something. Police would bring Terry in for questioning, and Terry Driver was arrested after they were able to match his fingerprint to the tape that was used on the wrench. They would later also match the DNA from Terry Driver to the semen that was on Misty. It would later be said that Terry would actually listen to the police scanner after making his taunting phone calls, and then he'd load his children in the car and go observe the police investigating the phone booths. When Terry was questioned, he actually lied, saying that he didn't attack Tanya and Misty, but he just happened to find the girls while they were unconscious. He wasn't able to resist his sexual urges when he saw the naked girls and had to have intercourse with Tanya. Tanya would stop breathing while he was raping her, and he got scared because he had left his semen on her, so he panicked. He said he loaded the girls into his car, dropped Misty off at the hospital because she seemed hurt, and then he would take Tanya to his favorite fishing spot on the river and throw her in. Terry chose trial by judge, meaning that there was no jury. It would just be the judge that would make the final decision on his convictions. This excuse did not fly with Judge Wally Opal, And he would be repeatedly questioned about his taunting phone calls, his threats to Misty, the gravestone being removed, the wrench through an innocent woman's window. I mean, if you weren't guilty, why were you doing that? Like, that doesn't make any sense. The defense tried to blame Terry's disorders, so his Tourette's and his OCD, saying that he was impulsive and couldn't always control it. The prosecutors would argue because there are many people who suffer from OCD and Tourette's that live very meaningful lives without harming people. During the trial, Terry also wouldn't show any signs of remorse or emotions, which Judge Wally Opal noted and brought up during the sentencing. The judge would find Terry guilty of first-degree murder on Tanya and attempting murder on Misty with life without parole. There was a preliminary hearing shortly after in regards to the other murders mentioned in his letter, and apparently he discussed it with a psychologist, but I'm not sure if he was charged or not. I wasn't able to find that information. His brother Don, who originally made the first phone call to police, thinks Terry was wrongfully convicted. He believes his brother's story of finding the girls and just making a mistake in how he handled it. His mother, who also called police, would say her biggest regret would be turning in Terry because he wasn't getting the proper treatment in jail. Audrey and Don would receive $10,000 in reward money from the government for turning Terry in, which some people would argue was blood money, but others were just happy he was behind bars. Val, Terry's wife, would temporarily lose custody of the kids to foster care, although it's unknown exactly why and for how long. Val would fall into a deep depression due to the fact that she married a killer. Misty would continue to suffer the after effects of this traumatic night for years and years. Even when she was older, she would struggle running into his family members in the community, and she was just trying to live a normal life. She stayed in the town of Abbotsford through everything and just tried her best to get through it. When she was older and on maternity leave, Val Driver, Terry's ex-wife, got hired at the grocery store Misty worked at. She obviously wasn't comfortable with this, but when she brought it up to the employers, they basically said that she quit or just come to work and deal with it. So she felt forced to quit. She felt like a victim all over again, and she just had no rights. She now works as a bereavement counselor for families of homicide victims and an advocate of victims' rights. She doesn't ever want to be perceived as a victim, but as a survivor. She will speak out for survivors and be the voice of people like her best friend Tanya. Misty is doing so much better, and I mean, she's so brave. I couldn't imagine just living through something so terrible and traumatic and then just have to move on with your life like nothing happened. It's just so unreal, but the community is thrilled that he was caught, and Terry is just an evil idiot. I don't even know what to say, but thankfully he's going to be behind bars for a very, very long time, for life, without parole. Thank you so much for tuning in to Felony Spectator and listening to our first episode. If you liked what you heard, please hit subscribe and tell your friends so we can grow our audience and be a huge part of the true crime community. Thanks again, and I hope you guys are having a great day. We'll talk to you soon.